Final Fantasy dominated the PS1 era so completely that it's easy to forget the platform also hosted a remarkable range of action RPGs that were doing things FF wasn't. Some of them were taking the genre somewhere darker. Some were experimenting with systems, real-time day-night cycles, monster breeding, non-linear world building, dual protagonists that the mainline RPGs of the era weren't attempting. Some are so experimental, they barely sold at all. This is about those games, what each one was doing that the rest of the genre wasn't, and why they deserve more attention than they received. Brave Proof is a 1998 Data West top-down action RPG that spent 22 years being inaccessible to non-Japanese players before a fan translation released in 2020. Reviews were dismissive. Famitsu noted its derivative nature, and the dismissal wasn't entirely wrong. It doesn't hide where it comes from. The dungeon structure, elemental magic via directional inputs, guardian spirits granting abilities. The influences are visible throughout. Data West even discontinued game development shortly after and pivoted to car navigation systems, which suggests the studio's own assessment of how it landed. What the fan translation revealed is a game whose combat system, however orthodox in concept, has a physical satisfaction to it that the period reviews didn't convey. The three-hit combo extending through directional inputs produces longer chains, the 6 guardian spirits, each absorbed from a boss and mapped to specific button combinations, create a manageable toolkit that the dungeon design builds around thoughtfully. The labyrinthine level structure, which reviewers criticize for lacking a map, reads differently when you accept it as intentional navigation design rather than oversight. It's a tight, 8-hour action RPG that never tries to be anything more ambitious than that. The distinction from better-known competition is modest. But as a Japan-only game finally playable in English after 2 decades, it represents the kind of minor genre gem that gets lost in the shadow of better resource games. Alundra is Working Design's 1997 localization of a Matrix software game, and it's the PS1 action RPG that commits most fully to the idea that the genre can carry genuine psychological weight. Set in the village of Inoa, where residents are being killed by nightmares they can't escape, the half-elf Alundra dives into people's minds to fight the demons warping their dreams from inside. The dream sequences are where the game's real design ambition lives. Each one is a distinct visual and thematic environment built around the psychology of the person whose head you're inside. One resident's nightmare is structured around obsession and repetition. Another's around guilt that has physically manifested. The imagery is dark in ways that 1997 console RPGs almost never attempted. The puzzle design matches the ambition of the theming. The dungeons are among the most demanding in the entire PS1 library, not through enemy difficulty, but through environmental logic. Block puzzles, pressure plates, switch sequences, and timed challenges layer into each other in configurations that require sustained thought. Players who bounced off the original's difficulty level will find the mid-game especially punishing. The overworld movement is fast and responsive, the combat is simple and functional, and the story, written by Working Designs with their characteristic voice, delivers deaths that genuinely land. Multiple major characters are killed, and the game doesn't smooth over their loss. The final third loses some coherence as the enemy design shifts toward combat over puzzles, and the localization's humor sometimes clashes with the tone the game otherwise maintains. Still, the most emotionally committed action RPG the PS1 produced. Saga Frontier is the 1997 Square RPG that the company almost didn't localize because they weren't sure Western audiences would tolerate how strange it is. 7 completely independent protagonists, each with their own story arc that runs 6 to 10 hours and shares nothing with the others beyond geography. No main character, no unified plot, no order imposed on the experience. Choose anyone, start their story, and the game treats that protagonist's arc as the entire game. Characters from one story appear as NPCs in another's, in completely different roles. The interconnection is lateral rather than cumulative. The growth systems are different for each character type. Humans gain skills from their equipped abilities by using them in battle. Monsters absorb abilities from creatures they defeat. Mystics fuse with absorbed monsters to create new forms. Mechs install programs. Understanding which growth system applies to which party composition and optimizing around it is the game's secondary skill set. The battle system is simultaneously simple at the surface and deep enough that optimal combat involves obscure knowledge about formation bonuses, combo chain triggers, and character-specific technique acquisition that the game never explains directly. 2 of the 7 protagonist routes, Fuses and Blues, were incomplete at release due to time constraints, which Square acknowledged. Amelia and Jin's routes are widely considered the weakest. T260G and Acellus are the ones most players cite. The game is rough, unconventional, and unfinished in specific documented places. It's also the most ambitious structural experiment a major publisher put into an RPG during the PS1 era. Legend of Mana is the series entry that asked what a JRPG would look like if it abandoned narrative structure entirely and built itself around artifact-based world generation instead. The landmark system is the game. You have a world map, you have artifacts collected throughout the game, and placing those artifacts on the map creates the locations that contain the story content. The placement affects the game's geography, which enemies appear, and which content you access. No 2 playthroughs look the same at the map level. The system was so unusual that most players in 1999 didn't understand what they were supposed to do with it, and the game sold poorly relative to its predecessors as a result. What the landmark system enables, when it works, is a game without a main story in the traditional sense. Instead, there are dozens of discrete story arcs, each complete in themselves, ranging from a romance between a ghost and a swordswoman to a political drama involving a scheming cactus. The writing in these arcs is consistently excellent, literary, character-focused, emotionally distinct from anything else in the Mana catalog. The music by Yoko Shimomura is arguably her best work. The action RPG combat is the weakest element, shallow and somewhat mechanical, but the game seems aware that the combat isn't the point. The crafting system is one of the most elaborate on the platform, involving affinities, materials, and weapon creation that absorbs players who engage with it fully. A game that was designed to be a museum exhibit rather than a narrative, and that works precisely because it commits to that decision completely. Parasite Eve 2 is the 2000 Squaresoft sequel that abandoned its predecessor's turn-based hybrid combat for something closer to Resident Evil. Fixed camera angles, tank controls, limited inventory slots, save points instead of autosave, and horror atmosphere replacing the New York thriller energy of the first game. Aya investigates a series of neo-mitochondria creatures in the desert town of Dryfield and the underground facility beneath it, and the structural logic is survival horror throughout. Resource management. Enemy encounters as problems to route around rather than experience to grind, and a consistent sense of tension about what's around the next corner. What makes it different from Resident Evil is the Parasite energy system, which is fully active in real time. You build the energy gauge by taking damage and spending it on mitochondrial abilities like Firewall, Plasma, and Heal creates a combat resource management layer that Resident Evil's fixed item framework doesn't have. The bounty shop system replaces traditional equipment shops with a currency earned from kills that lets Aya customize her gunblade with specific upgrades, attachments, and elemental modifications. The game's tone is more grounded and claustrophobic than the first game, which divided fans who love the original spectacle. The tank controls and fixed cameras feel deliberately restrictive rather than technically necessary. This was a design choice in 2000, not a limitation, and players who struggle with them will struggle with the whole game. For players who don't, it's a tightly designed survival action RPG that has aged better than most. Guardians Crusade, Night and Baby in Japan. is a 1998 Tamsoft JRPG whose technical claim to fame is genuine and specific. It runs without a world map. Most PS1 RPGs used miniature world map representations between locations or hard loading screens as transitions between areas. Guardian's Crusade presents a single continuous 3D world where towns, dungeons, and overworld exist at the same scale, with the same geometry and the same rendering pipeline throughout. Walking from a village into the surrounding countryside and then into a forest dungeon involves no loading screen, no map abstraction, no visual scale shift. The background music fades from zone theme to zone theme as you cross into different areas, but the world itself never interrupts or transitions. The same engine and scale govern ground travel, sea travel, and air travel once those became available. The game built around this achievement is gentler than the technical ambition suggests. Knight, a silent young messenger, and his fairy companion, a pink creature of divine origin, and set out to deliver it to its mother while helping towns along the way. The living toy companion system lets you summon small wind-up soldiers in battle as auto-attacking allies. Baby evolves forms as your bond deepens. The combat is turn-based and easy. The story is charming rather than complex, and the game was positioned as an entry point for younger players. Retrospectively, the seamless world is the legacy, the thing a more resourced developer would have built a more ambitious game around. Nobody gave Tamsoft that chance, and the seamless 3D world ended as a technical footnote rather than a design movement. The Grandstream Saga was developed by Shade, a Quintet subsidiary, and released in 1997. And it's considered one of the earliest fully polygonal RPGs, meaning environments, characters, and overworld built entirely in 3D geometry rather than using pre-rendered backgrounds for characters to walk in front of. This distinction from Final Fantasy VII and most PS1 contemporaries puts Grandstream in a small category of games that committed fully to the polygon pipeline before the tools were mature enough to make that look good. The character models have no faces. The polygon budget didn't allow it, which created an uncanny quality that reviewers in 1998 found unsettling, but that modern players tend to find charming or interesting. The setting earns the Quintet lineage, a world flooded by ancient catastrophe, for floating continents held aloft by magical orbs, those orbs failing. Ian investigates each island, restoring what can be restored. The narrative has the Quintet's signature of cosmic stakes rendered through small, specific human dramas, including a choice at the climax about which of two companions to sacrifice, which is tonally unusual for 1997. The real-time combat is the game's acknowledged weakness, sluggish, one-on-one, with enemies that block constantly. Most players found a dash attack exploit that bypasses the blocking system and makes the combat significantly faster. The game was likely balanced, assuming players would find it. Short at under 20 hours, with a story and world concept that exceeded the studio's technical means to deliver them. A Quintet game that didn't survive the transition to 3D intact, but that was building towards something the hardware couldn't support yet. Mega Man Legends 2 is Capcom's 2000 follow-up to the game that invented the template for 3D action exploration RPGs. Free-roaming 3D towns, NPC conversations with daily schedules, modular equipment customization, environmental storytelling through overheard dialogue. Legends 2 refines every element of the original's design. The weapon system is the mechanical highlight. Mega Man's Buster is built from components found in dungeons and shops. Different barrel, body, and power configurations produce distinct damage types, charge behaviors, and elemental effects. No two busters built from the same components behave identically, and the combination space is large enough to reward systematic experimentation. The story expands the Legends universe onto multiple islands and into the mythology around Mother Elysium, giving Mega Man Volnut a personal stake, his true identity and origin, that the first game deliberately left open. The four digger companions each have defined personalities, and the NPC depth of Nino Island and the surrounding towns makes returning to those areas feel like revisiting somewhere rather than navigating a menu. The movement and combat feel more fluid than the original, though the tank control legacy still requires adjustment time from players who haven't spent time with PS1 3D action games. The game sold 400,000 copies across all platforms, and then Capcom canceled Mega Man Legends 3 12 years later, after actively soliciting fan participation in the game's development, which generated one of the more bitter fan responses in the series' history. The story of Legends 2 ends unresolved, and nothing has changed since. Legend of Legaia arrived in 1998 from Procyon, and its combat system is one of the most original things the PS1 RPG library produced. The tactical art system works like a fighting game input. Attacks are mapped to commands, and specific sequences trigger unique moves called arts. Learning which sequences produce which arts across each character's individual move list, then building AP by landing basic hits to spend on longer sequences, creates a turn-based combat structure that rewards experimentation and memorization in ways that most random battle systems don't bother with. The act of figuring out the correct input sequence for a new art feels genuinely different from selecting from a list. The setting is oppressive in ways that complement the combat severity. The mist has descended on the world, covering everything and transforming exposed people into violent monsters. The Seru, symbiotic organisms that humans partnered with for their abilities, have been corrupted by the mist and now attack their hosts. The three protagonists bond with the uncorrupted ones, granting abilities and allowing merger with summoned Seru forms during battle. Restoring each Genesis tree clears the mist from a region and gradually rebuilds the world around the cleared areas. The game is long by action RPG standards, and the combat, however original, becomes repetitive across that length because the input combinations are still happening against largely the same encounter types throughout. The visual design of corrupted towns and mist-saturated environments is among the more memorable on the platform, and the story has real emotional stakes in its early to mid sections. Tail Concerto is a 1998 Bandai mech action game set on the floating island world of Prairie, where Officer Waffle pilots a police mech through a conflict between dog and cat factions, rescuing cats in a containment cage attached to the mech, fighting bosses in giant robot duels, and solving environmental puzzles with the mech's bubble gun and grapple. The mechanics mix platform game, action RPG, and mech combat in a structure that doesn't prioritize any of them over the others. Mech exploration, boss fights, and story cutscenes get roughly equal screen time. The experience is deliberately accessible rather than challenging, and the game completes in about 5 hours. The visual presentation is where Tail Concerto earns its reputation. Hand-drawn anime cutscenes delivered at a quality level most PS1 games didn't approach, integrated with in-engine exploration and combat without jarring transitions between the two production tiers. The characters were designed by Akira Yasuda, who worked on Street Fighter, and the world feels genuinely inhabited in ways the short runtime doesn't fully explore. As pure mechanics, the game is shallow. As an aesthetic and world-building achievement, it's exceptional. It earned his spiritual successor in Little Tail Bronx, and eventually Solatorobo Red, the Hunter on the DS, but neither replicated what this game was, a mech RPG aimed at an audience that wasn't sure mech RPGs for them existed. The genre combination remains underexplored, and the Prairie universe remains the only place anyone seriously attempted it in this register. For a 5-hour experience at late PS1 prices, the investment to return ratio is as good as any game on this list.
Here we go!
Brave Fencer Musashi is the 1998 Square action RPG that most people in the company's catalog have never played, and it's a stranger and more interesting game than anything with Final Fantasy in the title from the same year. The dual blade system, Lumina the light sword and Fusion the assimilation blade, runs on a philosophy borrowed from Kirby. Enemies have unique moves, and absorbing an enemy grants Musashi their ability until he uses it. Every enemy in the game is a potential toolkit entry. The system rewards paying attention to what each enemy does before killing them, which is a genuinely different relationship with combat than most action RPGs of the era establish. The real-time day-night clock runs throughout the entire game. NPCs follow schedules. Some are only reachable at night. Some events only trigger at dawn. Some shops close. Musashi gets hungry and tired across long play sessions, which affects his stats until he eats or sleeps. The castle he's defending loses soldiers to enemy capture over the course of the game, meaning side quests to rescue them have real consequences if ignored. The world is reactive in ways most PS1 games didn't attempt. The writing can be genuinely funny. The game is also short for a Square RPG, which works in its favor. A dense, complete 15-hour experience. The combat becomes repetitive in the final third, and the camera in closed spaces fights you. But nothing else Square made in the late 90s felt like this. Threads of Fate is the 2000 Square action RPG where you choose your protagonist at the start and get fundamentally different games depending on who you pick. Ryu is a brooding amnesiac fighter who can transform into any enemy he kills, inheriting their abilities and using them to solve puzzles and access areas his base form can't reach. Mint is a spoiled princess with a cheerful sociopathic streak who wants to take over the world, and whose story is played as comedy with a consistent comic timing that most action RPGs don't attempt. The two stories take place in the same world with overlapping events that read differently from each perspective, and completing both gives you the full picture. The transformation system for Ryu is the genuine mechanical contribution. Absorbing a large enemy lets Ryu transform into it and use its size, abilities, and movement to navigate areas designed specifically around what that form can do. Some puzzles require a specific transformation. Some can be solved with multiple creative choices, and the system creates a reason to engage with every enemy type in the game rather than routing around weaker ones. Mint's gameplay is entirely different. She lacks Ryu's transformation and instead levels her magic through use, with her personality making the tutorial village's reaction to her arrival consistently funny. The main story of both routes is fairly thin, and the game is short by Square standards at around 12 hours per route. But the dual-protagonist design, two complete games for the price of one, with genuinely different feels and styles, remains underexplored as a format even now.